Kim Strassel, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Was that the correct handle? Is that your handle, at Kim Strassel?
Yes.
Okay, good.
I have one bone to pick with you.
Sure. I'm sure you have many.
I do. But you talked about the Republicans unable to pass anything. We had a Republican Congress completely, Senate and House. And Obama only used his veto power just recently, just once. So why were they so ineffective in passing any of their legislation?
Well, they did pass a great deal of things. I mean, the House did in particular, and they took it to the Senate. There's a filibuster issue in the Senate, so they had trouble getting past that to begin with. If you don't have 60 votes, then you can't always bring things to the floor and even have a debate on them. And Harry Reid was very effective in using the filibuster to stop Republicans from getting things on the floor in the Senate. But look, the reality is, too, when the president has said he's going to use a veto pen, and you need 2/3 of the Senate and the House to override that. And there's no way you have it, given the sort of close numbers in the House and the Senate, then there's no point of sending it to his desk.
Hi. You said that you couldn't really see any suppression or pressure on free speech rights so much on the left, that it was coming from the left. Now, I wonder if you could compare the allegations of harassment against the Tea Party with the concerted effort nationwide by police to expel Occupy groups from public parks. I mean, that happened in hundreds of cities over a very brief time, and that seems to me a grave restriction of, the right to assembly, and far more serious than the isolated cases that you mentioned.
Well, I mean, I think that there is this question of, a lot of those Occupy movements by that point had been there for, weeks, months, and there had become a question of public safety and public health as well as some of these things, which had to be merit. I mean, no one was saying that they could not have a freedom of assembly to meet and have a conversation, but to go and occupy an entire city. I think that, it was in essence taking away the rights of others who lived in that city to actually live their lives. So those rights do have to be balanced at a certain point. But again, they clearly spoke very freely for a long time, until such point as there became issues about the ability for cities to simply manage themselves.
Hello. I'd like you to speak about university speech codes.
Yeah.
And whether university speech codes are being used to train people to accept limits on free speech.
Yeah, it's hugely disturbing. I was out and speaking at a university a couple of weeks ago, and it was good. There were some students that showed up, but you could tell that they were actually astonished. I'm not entirely sure they had ever actually looked at or thought about the First Amendment. It was extraordinary to me. The student newspaper had recently, or it was a student council, one of the two, and you'll have to correct me if I may be wrong and figure it out, but had recently written or passed a resolution saying that people were allowed to say whatever they wanted to as long as it was loving. Okay, my 5-year-old has a better definition. Well, actually, that's about right. I had a conversation with my kids a couple of weeks ago. My 5-year-old did tell me that free speech was you can say whatever you want as long as I like it. So, but we should expect more out of our college campuses. And speech codes are a violation of the First Amendment. And you see increasingly groups on campus of students who are pushing back against those because they are worried about it. I think the thing, we talk about campus speech codes and safe spaces. We need a safe space for the First Amendment. We need more debate, not less, in general. And one of those things people don't always realize, I talk about this in the book, some of this is spontaneous, some of it is mimicry. It happens in one campus and it spreads somewhere else. But some of it's organized. And it's actually very, very concerning to me. There's for instance, a group of unions and environmental groups that have formed something called Uncoke My Campus. And the Coke is not a reference to the soft drink. It's a reference to Charles and David Koch, who are billionaires, libertarians, and philanthropists. And Charles Koch's foundation does give money to universities to establish kind of free market programs, classical study programs. By the way, this is not out of the ordinary. You have billionaires on all sides of the aisle. George Soros gives tons of money to universities for
We're looking
different
for some
programs.
billionaires here at the Miller Center, by the way.
Yeah. So
if you bump into
you
any.
go and you have a word with them. But Tom Steyer, who's a very wealthy environmentalist, gives lots of money to start specific programs targeted toward things that they care about, social justice or environmental issues. So Charles Koch is out there, but this organization goes in and trains up students to protest any of these programs from being started at their universities. So they give them, training packages on how you can file FOIA requests to harass the administration, get in touch with your local press and gin up nasty stories, ally yourself with liberal professors on campus who will protest or threaten to resign if, this money comes in. So this is what's more worrisome to me, is that we actually have students who are actively working to close themselves off from ideas in universities.
Just to clarify on that, though, if a state university is organizing what you just described, then clearly there's a First Amendment issue. That's the state is interrupting the free exchange of ideas. But if that's being done by a private organization and privately motivated individual students, isn't that just free speech?
Oh yeah, they're totally welcome to protest anything that they want on campus. But
they may be wrong.
But what I'm saying is interesting is this is protest in the name of stopping speech. So, if that's really what you want to spend, if you're going to spend all of your speech trying to stop other people's speech, yes, you have a right to do it, absolutely, sure. But I don't think it's a very healthy way to run society.
Thank you for mentioning the constitutional parameters of speech that are a part of a policy discussion of public health and safety. So not far from here, just down the road, in the 80s, the moral majority started a concerted campaign to stigmatize gay, lesbian, transgender, and other people. And we know that flowed through decades that we've now lived through, and to the political benefit of many conservatives. We also know from public health science that has actually threatened public health in dramatic ways, which we see now in tens and hundreds of thousands of men of color who are gay or bisexual or both or whatever, who are now HIV infected. And so that's campaign, the politically organized campaign to stigmatize entire groups of people, entire populations, resulted in terrible public health impacts and personal and family and neighborhood and community impacts. So I think that's an issue that you might have some thoughts about from a political point of view, also from a moral point of view. Thank you.
Yeah, no, look, I think any time that we're out there, one thing that people forget is the right to having free speech, which we should all have, is not a license to be rude, or just a license to humiliate people or go out of your way to ruin people's lives, okay? This is a freedom, and it does occasionally result in very bad things, and we all have an obligation on ourselves to try to better our society rather than tear people down. Okay, so I have no doubt that, some of this has certainly happened over the years in which you have activist groups that have gone out and they have certainly attempted to stigmatize certain groups out there. A lot of this book is about people using government to enact intimidation, which I think is a more disturbing aspect of this. Although you do see activist groups still doing this today on both sides in ways that I think are concerning. One of the stories I actually tell in the book, and again, I kind of got into it only because it was using a federal tool to go after people, but it shows that it happens on both sides of the spectrum. People out in California who supported the Prop 8 ballot initiative in favor of traditional marriage. Okay, and by the way, I'm pro-gay marriage, but everyone has a right to express their views on a ballot initiative. They gave money for this. Activists went through financial disclosure forms, again, which I mentioned are a very worrisome new practice you're seeing happen. They put everybody's name and address who had given money in favor of that ballot initiative onto a searchable, walkable map so that you could go home to home and target them. The people whose names were on that list, they had their windows broken and their cars keyed. They had threatening messages left on their voicemail and their home email. Some of them lost their jobs, most notably Brendan Eich of Mozilla Corporation, who was hounded out of his position because of the fact that he'd given $1,000 to this initiative. So, these things happen on both sides. I don't justify their abuse on either side, but a lot of this is actually sort of geared at talking about ways in which people are using government or government tools to then intimidate each other.
And that sort of behavior is absolutely reprehensible, no matter who engages
no,
in
it's all
at any point in
reprehensible.
time.
Yeah,
there's
at
no
any
doubt.
point. No,
Now, whether
exactly.
there are other good reasons for some of these disclosures, is an extended discussion. But for sure, one thing we can all agree on is that kind of individual retaliation for someone's political expression is un-American and reprehensible.
Well, and I think the thing that was most disturbing is there was a lawsuit that came out of that, and many people who'd had these things happen to them were deposed. And nearly all of them, at the end of each of their depositions, finished by saying, based on what happened to me in this ballot initiative, I will not likely take part in a ballot initiative in the future. That's intimidation working. That's people now being scared to exercise their constitutional rights to have a voice in the electoral sphere.
Though also, and on this we're in large agreement, but I would also say I think the trick to so much of this comes back to your critique of the IRS, which I think is largely valid, of that, and it's counter to our judicial principles to pre-convict people before actions are taken.
Right.
And that's essentially arguably that's what that process perhaps was trying to do. At the same time, you could also say about what you've just described that the right way for that to work out is for the people who did bad things to be aggressively investigated and prosecuted for those criminal acts, and that doesn't necessarily mean that other useful purposes of disclosure have to be lost, but there has to be good enforcement of the actual actions that occur.
No, I think that's true. I do think, though, just to elaborate on the point about disclosure, I do think that it's time that we revamp it and rethink it, because, this was put in place in the 1970s, and if nothing else, inflation has caught up with disclosure.
Right.
I don't mean to sound cynical, but at the moment, if you give anything more than $199 to a federal candidate, it has to be disclosed. Again, not to sound cynical, but I work in Washington, and there ain't no politician in Washington who's going to get bought off for $200. Just not going to happen. I mean, you have to have an opening bid probably of like 10 grand before they'll even have coffee with you. Okay, so, do we really need to be disclosing amounts of $200? Or here's another question. Do we need to be disclosing money that's given to a ballot initiative? What's the potential for corruption there when you're exercising your interest in an idea that's up, for public voting in the state? Or do we, and this is, I think, a dicier one. Look, I still believe we need to keep track of money that goes to politicians and where the politicians spend money too, because those are the most obvious and evident potential for corruption. And that is what disclosure is meant to be for. But do we need to keep track, for instance, of disclosed money that goes for issue ads that don't necessarily advocate for the victory or defeat of a candidate, but simply talk about an issue? This healthcare law is bad, or go vote, or whatever it is. Should we have that? I mean, again, and the problem is disclosure, it's all screwy at the moment. All you have to do is watch Hillary Clinton's email affair to know that government has become very, very good at making sure we don't get any information about what it's doing. But there is a lot of politicians that are watching. And one last thing on disclosure, because I just think everybody should think about this a lot. The scariest part of disclosure is what you don't know how it's being used against you. Okay, you go and you apply for a job and you don't get it. Is it because the person interviewing you went and looked to see what your politics were? Your kid doesn't get on the varsity sports team. Is it because the coach knows who you donated to in the last campaign? I mean, these things happen. There are plenty of reasons why people prefer some anonymity in their political lives. Something we've lost. We did have some really good Supreme Court precedents on this. They've been kind of lost in time because of Watergate and campaign finance laws and disclosure laws, but I think it's time we rethink it given the environment we're living in today.
So one last question there from Charlie Smith in the back.
One of the questions I have is about a conversation I had yesterday with my youngest daughter, and she's in her 60s. And
Wow.
and anyhow, what I'm getting down to is she came up with, why don't we go ahead and limit the terms of all these people, including the Supreme Court? Whatever happened to the limited term?
Yeah, so I think people sort of soured on term limits in the end because it's not necessarily the case always that long-standing members, or a lot of people actually wanted to return some of their better people to government. And so there were a lot of conservatives who were in favor of term limits and after a while decided that that was not actually the way they wanted to go. My own view, I think that the better reform out there is an end to gerrymandering, because that's the real problem with our system at the moment, is that we cut out districts where people get, in essence, lifetime tenure because they're there, they're popular, they're always going to get elected in that district. It allows the party machine to choose who's going to replace them and run because they know that they're going to win that district no matter what happens. I mean, I could be wrong, but like there's a seat in Michigan that John Dingell's family has had for 110 years, I think, or something like that. Like his dad had it and he had it and now his wife has it. It's kind of crazy. So I think that that's one thing that you can do to make the system more responsive. But the other thing, and again, this always surprises people when I say it because they're so tuned to hearing the opposite. You really want more competition in elections. You really want to have incumbents who come and challenge the status quo, and all the guys that are there have more money in elections. Because I will tell you what, the only people that benefit from campaign finance laws are incumbents. They have the power of their office. They have the ability to be speaking, have the cameras in front of them all the time. And they have the ability to go out to all those kind of different groups that support them. The people who have the most need to have money and actually challenge the status quo are the guys that are limited by campaign finance laws.
Kim, thanks for coming.
Thank you.
That was
Thanks.
great.